Right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Talking Niagara with me, Peter Giblett. And while Dave Wheeler's away, Angela Browne is outstanding. But we're doing things slightly different this at this time while Dave's away, because instead of kind of going through specific news items, we went through a kind of, hey, what's the most important things we need to do in this area? And if you recall, one of the things that Adam Hyde talked about when I had the session with him, so it's not just you and me, Angela, here. One of the things he said about was he was remembering the good times he had in Japan, whereby he could get up in the morning, go, leave at a specific time and arrive at a specific time, all using public transit. There was no car, there was no any of that. He just, everything would work smoothly, like it does in many parts of the world, right? Europe, Germany. I joke about German trains is like they are on time all the time, every time, forever, right? And
Mm-hmm.
usually, when there's a dispute going on at the rail yard, because they're 1 minute late. They're always 1 minute late if they're in contract negotiations. They're 1 minute late.
Work to rule orders.
It's a work to rule
Mm-hmm.
order, yes.
Mm-hmm. But you
Oh,
didn't have you might have Mussolini in charge, make everything run on time.
yeah. And here's an interesting thing: is I've got Mike Cushman. Good morning, Mike Cushman, who's normally our first Facebook commenter, and I have a brand new. We have a brand new YouTube commenter, Robert Dupal. So good morning, Robert. So there we go. We got some people on Facebook
Ooh,
right now. So
I
go
know
in.
them.
Yeah,
Hi,
there we go.
Robert. Hello, Mike.
So it's no secret that public transportation continues to present challenges for communities in rural and semi-rural areas like Niagara. A lot of people have been talking about it for a long time, but it's like we are such a car culture here, aren't we?
Yeah, this is it. I mean, it just seems that even our businesses, when you look at the industries outside of tourism, it all has to do with cars.
Well, yeah,
You're
and
making them, fixing them, you're making parts for them, painting them, cleaning them, whatever you're doing, it's all to do with cars. And really, if you don't drive, you don't really want any part of that.
well, it's a problem. It's a problem because, okay, so I do my show in the morning. I run, and I make my sandwich. I run out to the car and I jump in and I drive. I drive the what's it 17, 18, 19 kilometers to St. Catharines. Park the car and I'm in the office in half an hour from the time I leave home. Now, I'm not saying that I would expect to get there in the same amount of time, but if I can get there in 45 to 50 minutes by public transit, I'd probably leave the car at home.
Yeah, exactly. But public transit, here you're still on the bus for half a day,
Yeah.
and you don't want to spend
Well,
half a day on the bus.
yeah. And that's an interesting thing because you said there was one of the things you sent me a report. Now I can you sent me a report that and now I can't find it. I can't find the damn thing. You sent me something whereby there was a comparator done, and what they basically found was that, for example, comparing bicycles to going by car, and assuming that you can cycle 12 miles an hour, the
Mhm.
average time you would take to get to and from work increases for a cyclist.
Mhm.
Takes up vast majority of their day compared to, yeah. So if you're on, you know, well, if you're going by bike or versus public transit, irrespective of how much you earn, if you're going on public transit, you've kind of got 50%, about 40% of your day tends to be in transit. As if you're going by bicycle, 50% of your day tends to be on the bicycle. And obviously, the assumption here is that you still work the same number of hours, but if you're going by car, then typically what's happening is that something like, if you're on a low wage job, or if you live local to where you work, like where I do here, Niagara Falls to St. Catharines, then you're spending 20% of your day traveling. Whereas if you're on a high end job, maybe you're spending more. Maybe you're going further, like Hamilton, Burlington, etc. So you spend a greater percentage of your time traveling.
Yeah. I don't know whether you're looking at the OECD study or whether you're looking at the VPTI study. Okay,
This
because
was
there's
the
yeah.
This was the Victoria one.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah, because
Victoria?
Todd Littman is the head of the Victoria Institute for Public Transit. It's very he only studies transit and how to develop equity in terms of transportation policy.
Is this Victoria as in Victoria, British Columbia, or is it Victoria, Australia?
I think it's British Columbia.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's been around for a long time, and he's somewhat considered a subject expert on transportation. And I've mentioned a number of his studies before. When I was doing some of the research and the feedback to Niagara region on how to set up transportation.
Yeah,
So,
basically,
yeah.
what he's assuming here is assuming basically you can go at 12 miles an hour, and basically it costs you, in order, the maintenance on the vehicle is going to be 10 cents a mile. Public transit, you can probably travel at about 15 miles an hour, but you're going to spend 30 cents a mile on the transit. Auto, in the car, and this is not in the rural areas, but in the urban areas, you're going to go at 25 miles an hour, but you're going to spend $5,000 for 4,000 miles, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of that in terms of subsidization. What he talks about is that people who drive their own vehicles, everybody thinks, oh, well, drivers pay for the roads, drivers pay for everything. Drivers do pay some of it, but in fact, drivers don't pay most of it. Most of it's paid for by the public.
Most of what you pay, in terms of, if they were to build, and I'm not making any recommendations here, if they were to build a new QEW, right? Let's say that we determined that there was a new road needed, and that we needed a direct road between Niagara Falls and London, for example, just to be completely out there. And therefore, the Highway 20 was going to become a new highway that was headed towards London, right? So if, say, they did that, basically that is, it costs a lot of money to actually create such a highway. It's probably these days, it's probably in the region of $10 million a mile just to create such a brand new highway, right? And where does that come from? That comes from everybody's pay packet. It comes from our taxes the whole way through. But then again, if we're going to be honest about it, if we were going to, instead of building that highway, we were going to now build a Welland to St. Catharines train route, Port Cockburn via Welland to St. Catharines train route, in order to link up with the Metrolinks, it's probably going to be about the same kind of cost, probably $5 to $10 million a mile to build a railway.
Yep.
Right?
But it will also have the benefit of economies of scale as time goes on, with a lot more people to use it,
Well,
as opposed to single car occupancy.
Essentially that's an interesting argument, because of course, as we go back to what I was saying about at the beginning of the show with Adam talking about what it was like, and in Japan, the fact that you could get on a train, you could plan your day around train travel. And I wouldn't say that I could plan my day around train travel when I worked in London. I couldn't assure you that I would get an on-time train, but most of the time it worked, right?
Yep.
Most of the time I wouldn't wait more than 3 minutes for a tube train. It would take me 45 minutes to get into the center of town and a 5-minute walk at the other end. But even when you go to places like London, whereby they were building tube lines between the 1880s, when they built the Circle Line and the Metropolitan Line, through to 1977, when they opened the new Jubilee Line in London. And they've been building a long time. But even in central London, there are times you could walk 5 miles to get to a tube station, even in central London today, right? So it doesn't mean to say that just because you have one of the world's greatest, transit networks, doesn't mean to say you're not going to be walking for a portion of your journey, right?
Well, walking is good for you, but in some places, like, you might have transit on demand to get you to the nearest tube station, for example. If you have an issue with walking, they do that in Niagara region. They do have transit in demand to get people to the nearest regional transit.
You see, when I was younger, I don't know whether such things existed, but when I was younger, I don't think there was any transit on demand to actually get you to the local tube station. Right. And that may be a new development.
Yeah. Well, this is something that a lot of people talk about, and is needed. Did you know Niagara region had one of the top transit train systems at one time? From the 1800s up until 1959. It's called the Niagara, St. Catharines and Toronto Railway, NS&T Railway.
Okay. And what happened to it?
Well, it got gradually where one of the car companies, they started buying it up, and then they bought buses, and then the buses were just set up where the services were not as good, and then they sold the bus service to the municipality. I think it was Niagara Falls, or I forget which municipality. But I've got a book on it, which was written by somebody who's done some research on it. And the issue is that I think most of our urban planning, sadly enough, is being determined by the automobile. Not done in terms of what's common sense for people to get around. Yes, you're going to get around by automobile for some things, but you'll also need other ways to get around.
Well, let's say, for example, that if I worked, let's say, in the tourist core right now, it would be easy to assume that I was okay. If I worked in the tourist core right now, it would be easy to assume, hey, that's okay, Peter can just walk to work.
Yeah, like, that is an assumption that's held. Like, maybe you could walk to work, maybe you might not. I used to walk to work when I was young, and up north when I worked. And I used to walk all the way to work, and I'd walk through a wooded area all the way up to the other part of town. I used to walk. Depends on how far you could walk. Like technically, you could walk anywhere, but really,
Yeah.
how far can you walk?
Well, okay. Mike says in the 1800s to in late 1800s to early 1900s, they had an electronic trolley system, and that's actually consistent
That's the
with what a lot of
NS&T. Yeah,
cities did, right?
yeah, that's the NS&T system, and that's 1959 when the last train ran.
Yeah, and there's actually consistent with what a lot of cities did around Europe as well. They had trams as well as other systems to get around. And okay, Robert makes the point. It took him an hour to get from St. Catharines to St. Catharines by bus from Hamilton. Yeah, actually, that surprises me because that actually is pretty good. I would say that if you got on like Coach Canada or a let's say a Metrolinx one, the Go bus, I think you can plan those, right? You could certainly go from one place and know that you're going to get to say somewhere like St. Catharines at a specific time,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
and
Unless it
yeah,
happens
it's
unless you have the misfortune to hit a mega traffic jam on the QEW.
yeah. Well, this is what they're trying to resolve,
Yeah,
possibly with the GO trains, right? So that people don't have to worry about the QEW traffic or the Burlington bottleneck.
yeah,
Yeah. So the NS&T was actually considered a really good high class transit system at the time. People were able to get throughout the whole region and to Toronto even using that system. And it was it was considered very effective. We had several stations within Niagara. Okay. If you go back to the old collections and libraries and stuff, you'd find that you'll see pictures of the cars and of the stations and different things. So they were like trolley cars or trains that people would get on.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, and well, and here's the question about a lot of that though, is that I actually wonder whether you see, I remember what we used to be in England they used to call what branch lines. So, for example, if I went to go and see my grandma, as a kid, we used to take the mainline train down to along the way. There was a station along the way that we get off at, and then we get onto the branch line to go to my grandma's place in Swanage. Then what happened in the 60s and 70s, or it started in the 50s, but 50s, 60s, and 70s, they started removing the branch lines because they were not
Yep.
profitable.
Yeah, and this is where you have to look at how these things are funded. Okay? They were finding that when you start looking at using the trains and the services for profitable reasons, okay, like you were showing an example between the U.S. and the European system. Okay? The U.S. system depended more on trains for freight, while the European system was building the system more for people
Yeah.
and transporting people
Well,
because more public funding was available.
you do freight transit in Europe. It's just that what you have typically in most rail lines in Europe is four lanes, right?
Hmm.
You have the up and down train, what are called fast up and down lines, and then you have the freight or slow up and down lines,
Yeah.
right? The freight runs on the slow up and down lines. Up and down being it's up if you're heading towards the big city
Yeah.
like London, right?
Hmm.
Down being away from the city, right? So basically, you would have those lines, and if you were
And this
on
is
the
sort of like the GO line. This is sort of like the GO line where people are talking about how they have to build it so that both the what is it, the CN line, CN
yeah
owns it, So GO Line has to work out some kind of agreement and then also have an extra line so that GO Transit can move as well as the freight lines can also work.
Yeah.
So that
And
the CN continue to make money out of it.
yeah, and the difference between here and Europe is here we have these mega long cargo trains. Europe, most of those cargo trains, whilst they're longer than normal trains, not much longer. So they might be may only be 50 cars long or something.
Mm-hmm.
But they do that for the reason that they need to get they need to get the slow trains going as well between them. Right. So
And the push for public transit, the very important thing here that I put in there is a push for public transit is also where it's not only for people who can't drive or don't want to drive. It's for people, for everybody, because right now we're talking a lot about climate change and talking about like a very large portion of the carbon emissions are from transportation.
Well,
Right?
and actually,
Not all of it,
transit,
but a good amount of
yeah.
it is.
Well, public transit, especially if you're talking about rail type transit, is and has for a long time been clean, because what you if it's done properly, you tend to have line electrification. So you got electric trains rather than diesel trains. At the moment, we have diesel trains taking the GO Transit up and down to Toronto. Right? They haven't figured out either a third line system or an overhead electrification system. But then again, part of the problem there lies, and I was talking about this to a train driver, and this train driver was saying to me, one of the big problems that we have is that we don't have independent rails for passenger trains. Right?
Yeah.
If we want to, it's possible to cut in half the time it takes, or even more. It's possible to actually have a train that can get us to New York in an hour. Right? If you use the Japanese bullet systems at 400 miles an hour, it's possible to get them to get to New York in a couple of hours, right? At the very most. But in order to do those, you've got to have specialist track that's properly maintained, because that track, as it goes around a curve, slopes. Right? I can't
That's
say I
similar to
know
the rail. Yeah. That's similar to the rail that takes place into the Pearson Airport in Toronto, which is a very fast train that can take people up there. And they need to have that. And that's going to take a while to be able to electrify that, because they have to find out a system to be able to do this consistently throughout the whole Metrolinx tracks. Because they're building tracks, they're building new routes, new service everywhere, and producing more trains. So they're trying to get that to different places. And this is more what they call an inter-regional or between regions, their transit. So people in Niagara can get to Toronto, people from Kitchener can get to Toronto or to Hamilton, whatever. Okay, but that's going to take some time to be able to build. Okay, and I'm hoping that they can bring it up to where they promised us 11 rides each way a day, like in Niagara region.
Well, here's actually a more interesting thing is the 11 rides a day. If we get to and from Toronto, is one thing. That's one issue. But again, for example, there is a problem getting anything across from Niagara through to St. Catharines on the Niagara side of the canal, unless we build tunnels. Right, we'd have to build a tunnel in order to make that system work. Either a tunnel or a super bridge, and I'm not in favor of a super bridge. I think they're, we would have to put the trains through the tunnels, and that would be the best route to get past the
Hmm.
past the canal. The problem lies with, that's the biggest problem you have between Niagara and St. Catharines. For example, you do have, if you were to take, what we don't have is any form of kind of rail system connecting, how would you call it? Connecting basically Welland and other places into there, right?
Yeah, this is where one of the problems, because you'd have to go in there with the rail. See, because
And
Niagara
although,
region, like everybody wanted to have GO Transit in the Niagara region, but the problem with having GO Transit, you also have to have good regional transits to support
yeah,
it.
and we don't
Okay,
have
because
that.
yeah,
We don't have that
exactly,
at all. Yeah.
and this is one of the problems. So we're going to have to do it. Like there was also something too that I gave. There was a later article I sent you about how to set up transit as if not having a license actually mattered. Because right now, what they talked about is people who don't have driving licenses are absent from many planning decisions. They should be there at the table and making the planning decisions. Most decisions about where trains go, where buses go, where all these public transit systems go, are all based on people who drive, who will probably never set foot in one of those vehicles. Okay, we
Well,
have to have
and
we have
and
to
that
have
was,
people who rely on those.
yeah, and that was absolutely very clear. If you look about 10 years ago when I first looked at it, at the Niagara Falls transit system, it basically went up and around a big square, right? And that was route one. And then it would go, there would be another route which would go up and around a big square, and that's route two. All right. Another route that go up and around a big square, and that's route three. And there's about three routes that cross those diagonals. And it's like, I'm thinking, are you freaking mad? Who designed this? Certainly
Hmm.
not somebody who even uses the system. You know, I would also say that, hey, I stick my hand up and say, I'm not the person to design the Niagara Falls transit system, because I
Hmm.
don't, because my job was driving at the time.
Hmm. Yeah.
But where I'd get involved is I'd get this kind of request: can you pick up Mary from this location and take her to this location? So on the way, I'd speak to Mary. These are the odd places to take you from and to, and she said, "Yeah, I missed my bus."
Hmm.
And by moving to the next, she'd basically move on to the next bus stop, bus place you could get the bus at. And, so she could get her next bus, right? She's
Hmm.
20 minutes early, but, hey, I'm here.
Yep. And this is something that's very annoying because at nighttime, even in St. Catharines, which is the largest city of the region, it's every hour for most buses.
Well, and that was actually, so do you recall, about 6 weeks ago, a couple of months back, I had to take my car in on an emergency, and while I got dropped off at the office by the people from the car company, I couldn't get home. They called me later in the day and said, we can get you home. So then I went looking up transit, and they're basically saying, well, there was a bus at 6 o'clock, there was a bus at 7 o'clock, but hey, the Niagara Falls transit from that bus hub in Dorchester Morrison, which I think is the craziest place for a transit hub, they finished at 5:30. Like,
See,
what?
that's
Yeah,
exactly what kind of sense it makes when people who drive are making up all the transit routes.
yeah.
They
And
need to make it considering people who don't drive. Like I'm not saying
yeah,
people who drive wouldn't have a say in it because many people who drive might want to use the transit.
yeah.
So they would want
And
to set it up the way they would like to see it as well, so they could leave their car at home sometimes.
well, from
But
my
those who
perspective,
don't drive. need to be able to get places.
Well, from my perspective, that's absolutely crazy because here in Niagara Falls, this is a 22-hour city, right?
Hmm.
And I say 22 because basically we operate from 6 a.m. till 4 a.m., right?
Hmm.
It's a 22-hour city, right? Why there's no buses after 5:30 is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
So what happens is people who don't have the money, they start shelling out for cabs or
Yeah.
Ubers, and this is it's very expensive. So what happens is people who have good money and a driver's license, they will just drive, and it doesn't cost that much to drive, even though we all complain about the price of gas. And on here, everybody complains about the price of gas. Hey, and yeah, it's sometimes can get ridiculous, particularly when we don't have a lot of control over that. But people who have to use taxis or Ubers, that is
Well,
expensive.
you see, it seems obvious that we can set up buses, or we can set up a bus that can go down a city street, right? That's an
Hmm.
obvious thing. Whether you're in St. Catharines, whether you're in Niagara Falls, whether you're in Fort Erie, you could probably pick that there are bus routes where people need to get from this point here to this point here, and you can figure a route out, right? And you'll know that you could just do a go do a survey, go walk up to people on the street and say, hey, where do you travel from to,
Hmm.
right? Just ask them, and you could
Yep,
probably get a good idea about the spread of, even if you didn't get every route that was possible, you could get a good idea of the spread that people go, and you can figure out that along that route there's you can build a route which takes care of quite a number of people that along a particular road, takes care of their needs, a lot of their needs. And people might give up the car if they can get to work easily by public transit. uh,
exactly.
especially when you consider, hey, I drive into St. Catharines, and St. Catharines is a real nightmare for parking.
Hmm.
You can't just leave your car in at the side of the road. You're going to get ticketed.
$50 ticket. fifty
Yeah,
dollar ticket.
exactly. You're going to get a $50 ticket. So you can't just park anywhere you want. There's everywhere, and every city you go to these days, ticketing is an issue, isn't it? Always an issue.
Yes, exactly. And in Toronto, even back in the 90s, and I used to drive up to Toronto. And driving up to Toronto, it was never for a problem for me to drive into Toronto and around Toronto, but the problem was finding parking. So you'd be spending like time finding parking, and this is one of the things that where it was very much of a problem. They would say like I couldn't find parking. So here you are, you're driving around. Now, what is that doing to the what is that doing to the atmosphere? Right? When people are driving around, they can't find a
But
place to park.
here's an interesting thing. Randy West says you already have a virtually unused public system, and the problem is people won't walk, right? Yeah, and it's true. But if you listen to what Adam said last week, if you build it, people will come. People
Exactly.
will
You
use it,
have, yep, yep. You'll
right?
have to build it the way that people operate.
Need it. Yeah.
If you start finding that people like to go take the train, take the bus downtown to a central hub, and then from that central hub, then they have to go to other places, then that's what the transportation system should offer. What
Well,
we have right now is people will have, yeah, but do you really want a freedom of a car? I don't think people who drive definitely want the freedom of the car, because I was reading one of the articles saying if you're living in a car dependent type of place, what happens if your car breaks down?
Well, that
What
actually
happens
was
if you get in an
that's
accident?
exactly that was exactly my argument. There was I could get a St. Catharines to Niagara Falls bus, to get me back from St. Catharines to Niagara Falls, and I could get a planned time, and I knew what time it would arrive in Niagara Falls. But then
Yeah,
I've got a half-hour walk home from there,
yeah.
right?
And the
And
thing
that
is, and the system right now of car dependency fails to address a good portion of the population, at least 50% of the people with disabilities. They don't drive. Many older people don't drive. A lot of younger people don't drive. And lots more younger people are delaying getting their licenses well into their 20s, even their 30s. And there's other people who have other reasons they don't want to drive. Some people just choose not to. And other people simply cannot afford the cost of owning and maintaining a vehicle. So how are these people going to get around when everything has to be relied on the freedom of an automobile? The freedom of an automobile seems to be more of a privilege.
well, it is an interesting thought for you, and this is US, but I'm sure it's about the same here. One third of people living in the US do not have a driver's license. And
Yeah,
and again,
Niagara region, a third of people don't drive. 30% people don't drive in Niagara region.
and I'm sure that you see, for example, when I lived in London, I didn't get a car until I was about 20, 26, 27, 27.
Yeah.
Right. I got a car about a year before my son was born.
Hmm.
Right. When I got married, somebody said, "Hey, you should have a car," and proceeded to want to sell me one.
Yeah, that's what they do. They want to sell you a vehicle. Yeah, and
Right.
there's other people who don't have a license, and anybody who drives right now could very much lose their
And
license.
I'm saying the other aspect about this is that when you go to somewhere like Toronto, when you go to somewhere like New York, people living in those cities often have a car at home, right? That's in their garage, but they go to work by public transit. And on a Saturday, they go shopping they go to the mall shopping, or they go
And I've
wherever.
known people in Toronto who don't even have a license, and they're in very high employment situations. We don't find them here. We don't find them here in Niagara, and you can't even get a job if you don't have a license in Niagara. So how are you
And
going to
that's a
support people
problem.
who don't have
That's a
jobs?
problem. Yeah.
Right? If you don't have job, how are you going to support these people? Who want to work but can't get to work because they don't have a license. So there has to be some other way of getting people around, other than relying on everybody having an independent vehicle.
Well, and the other issue there is, um,
So I remember chatting with this one guy. He's got a very high position in government, and he's one of those people that we always find on the sunshine list all the time. And I had a chat with him, and I was talking to him about what it was like to live in Niagara, where it didn't have a TTC and so forth. And he was saying, "I don't even have my driver's license." He says, "I
yeah.
don't even have my driver's license." And then he said, and I go ask him, I said, "Well, how do you get out of town, and how do you shop? How do you go places?" And he says, "Well, there's buses, there's trains, there's planes, there's taxis. You don't need to drive when you're in Toronto."
That's actually one of the key factors, and you don't need to drive. And again, you don't need to drive if you're in London, Paris, Berlin, a lot of those kind of places,
Yeah,
because they all have their own transit systems, right?
yeah,
The problem becomes somewhere, and the same. I'm going to say, you don't need to drive if you live in New York or
yeah.
Washington D.C. or Chicago, because they have their transit systems, right?
And I've also heard of people saying that it's a hindrance to even have a car, even if they wanted to drive. That was just a big hindrance because of all the congestion and difficulties finding parking. Like, as I said, during the 90s, when I'd go to Toronto, you couldn't find parking, hey, when you go and travel up there. And
Well,
this is one of the things.
okay, so 5 bags of groceries and looking for a bus. Yeah, Randy, that was exactly the situation where I was saying a lot of Toronto people would not, they have their car back at home. So when they're doing their grocery shopping, they go out by car.
Yeah, or they take a taxi or Uber. Okay, so this
That's
is
the
what the
other
guy
people.
was saying when I asked him about groceries or taking a load home of somewhere, going to Home Hardware or something. They just take other transportation services that would assist them or have
Well,
deliveries.
you see, actually, when I was younger, more or less what I would do is, before I got married, when I was very much younger, I'd go home by tube. If I needed some groceries, I'd stop by the supermarket on the way home and walk home with my 2 plastic bags in my hand, right? Um, I'd get home and, hey, that was my shopping done for the next few days, right?
Mhm.
I wouldn't do shopping on a Saturday,
Mhm.
right? But as I when I got married, of course, shopping was a Friday night or a Saturday night thing, Saturday
Mhm.
thing, right? And 5 bags of groceries would not be done by hand. Wouldn't walk them. Wouldn't go in the bus, right?
Mhm.
But I've known plenty of people over the years. I've seen plenty of people go by bus, to go do grocery shopping. And the funny thing is that I've always, for example, I go to my mother-in-law's in London. It was always go by bus.
Mhm.
Go on the tube, get to Liverpool Street, go by bus the rest of the way.
Yep. Yep. You need to have methods of getting around. What's very important for people to get around also is social. If you can't get to social events or can't get
Yeah,
to community events to meet people or get to places like schools or courses
uh,
or
that's
things like that, like you're not getting out of the house, and chances are you're not going to meet anybody, and you can be very isolated. And there's lots of studies about that. In suburbanization of our communities, that's what's happening. People are
well,
becoming more isolated and lonely.
that's an interesting point there. And hey, I remember many a night bus when I was a kid, when I was younger, not kid. When I was in my 20s, I remember many a night bus because
That's
you'd
still
go
a
out.
kid.
You see, yeah, okay, okay. But you see, if I went out somewhere, let's say, I don't know, you go somewhere with friends, and of course you live on the opposite side of London to where they do. But you've gone to your party that finishes at midnight or something, and hey, I'm heading for the night bus home.
Hmm.
Right,
Yep.
it might take me 2 hours to get there, but at least I'm heading for the night bus home. Whereas, whereas today in Niagara, there's often things I won't go to because if I go there, I'm going to have a few beers, and if I have a few beers, I'm therefore not going to drive. How do I get home? Because we don't have public transit. I know we have. I know we have things like those people who will drive your car home for you, but I'd prefer not to have my car in the first place if I'm going out somewhere I'm likely to drink.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then that factors in. Um, you go somewhere, and I might get home in a car, but it's not my car, it's a taxi.
Hmm. Yeah, and
And
this is how a lot of people get home because they're always telling people to get home by taxi or public transit or whatever if they're drinking. But there's got to be public transit available, hey, or
well,
taxi if they
and
need it.
actually the funny thing is because I come from London, I wouldn't often go by taxi, because to go by
Hmm.
taxi is one of the most expensive forms of transit in London,
It is still expensive here, but
right?
unfortunately for many, there's no alternatives.
Yeah.
And this is where they have to look at, because if you're low income, your time is worth nothing. If you're higher income, your time, you do have valuable time, but people who have lower income, their time is just as valuable. Like, they have to get to work, they have to do different things, they have to go places. Like, for them to spend half a day on the bus, it's just as frustrating if you had to spend half a day on the bus. So it has
Yeah.
to be done so there's a balance. We call that vertical equity, which was described by Todd Littman in his study, where people have equal opportunity and access to various destinations in the community and various destinations to get around. Because the purposes of transportation vary for where you have to go. What happens if you can't get to your medical doctor, or you have a medical doctor that's in St. Catharines and you happen to be in the other end of Niagara Falls up in Chippewa and you don't drive?
Yeah.
It becomes very discouraging, for
I
people, and
get
it's
it.
actually proven to be a factor where they tend to miss medical appointments and various things. So
Well,
these things have to be addressed.
you miss medical appointments with my doctor, and you risk being fired by the doctor.
Yep. My doctor finds them. She charges them $53, which they have to pay the next time they show up.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
yeah. Basically, no. The ones in our doctor's network. Basically, it's a $50 fine if you're the first. If you miss one appointment, right?
Hmm.
And if you miss a second appointment within the year, you can be fired.
Yeah, exactly. That happens. And doctors get frustrated because that's their time and they only get paid for their time. It's
Yeah.
similar to our office where we only get paid for our time. So if somebody says, well, we're going to show up at such and such a time, we set time aside and then they don't show. Yeah, we have a policy in place where people miss appointments and they get billed. They get billed for it. It's written right into our agreement. So these are things that are there, but as a city and as a community, we have to facilitate so that people can get around, people can get places, so that is not a barrier. Okay. And our
Well,
buses now are designed where if you're in a wheelchair that you can get onto the bus and get off a bus. So
yeah, that
it's
that
very
actually is
interesting.
something that actually is pretty amazing when you consider that the buses that I remember getting on as a kid, where you had to, your choice was either up a step and go along to the ground floor, or up many steps to go along to the upper floor. So those buses were not designed for anybody in a wheelchair.
Yep. Yep.
Right?
And they probably had something like handy trans at the time that they would take you around,
I
and they
don't
would
know.
be in a
I
van,
really
like
don't
in
know
a,
what would happen. I really, looking back to
yeah.
my youth, I don't know what would happen to a person who was handicapped.
Yeah. I know here we had something called paratrans, but there were some issues with paratrans because you had to book 2 weeks ahead. Okay. So you have to book 2 weeks ahead because you plan to go and meet with a friend to go for a coffee. Okay. So you have to plan 2 weeks ahead. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
Okay. You really want to get up in the morning and say, oh, I feel like calling Joe today because I want to go out and have a coffee with him. Okay. But you can't have that spontaneity when you have to plan 2 weeks ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Um, so we got a number of, you know, tra- travel demands, right? Seniors who do not and should not drive, being one of them. Typically, there are about 10 to 20% of residents. People with disabilities, about 3 to 5% of residents. Adolescents with kids 12 to 20 years of age, which are about 10 to 20% of residents. Drivers who share vehicles. Now, that's an important one where, people who live together can only afford one vehicle, right? Drivers who temporarily lack vehicles, right? Because your last one broke and you can't afford a new one, right? Low income households who spend more than affordable for vehicles, which is about 20 to 40% of households. Tourists and visitors, well, that's always very, in this city, it's bigger than in your city, right?
Hmm.
People who are impaired or distracted by alcohol, drugs, and devices. Again, that one definitely is up there, right?
And the
People who want,
category of people who shouldn't be driving.
yeah, absolutely, the category where they should never be driving.
Hmm.
People who want to walk or and bike for health and enjoyment reasons, right? They're saying basically 40 to 60% of residents, according to this research, who want to be in that category. Plus pets on leashes, yeah, I guess. And most motorists fall into the category of motorists who want better travel options for other travelers,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. And also having better bus service and better transit service. It's better for those who drive. Because would you want a road that's less congested,
Yeah.
less
Oh,
crowded,
yeah. Yeah.
and have more parking available? Hey, so that if other people are getting around by transit and by trains and so forth, and then some people are getting around by cars, hey, the road is less congested and you're freer to move around. But if everybody has to go by car, the roads are going to be pretty going to be pretty darn crowded.
Car defines spontaneity, says Randy West. There you go.
Well, it's spontaneous until you lose your driver's license. When you lose your driver's license, then you'll realize what spontaneity is and what privilege is.
Yeah.
And I think that,
Right.
and anybody could lose it. I was in a room one time with people with disabilities, and I asked if anybody didn't have a driver's license. More than half of the hands went up in the room, and among the hands that went up in the room, almost all of them were under 65, some in their 20s, who did not have a license or had it taken away from them for various reasons. All you have to do is develop a medical condition. A doctor can write to the ministry and have your license taken.
Well, actually, the funny thing is that we in our office we get all sorts of people come in, and I do recollect somebody who said to me, "Okay, tell me, make sure you tell me. I want to do my hearing in your office, right? Because it's best for me because I don't have a computer at home to do these Zoom hearings on. Just make sure you give me at least 2 weeks' notice so that I can arrange transit to get in,
Absolutely.
right?
And there's quite a few people. And we're not talking about low income people either. A lot of
No.
them have disabilities. They're paying their legal bills, so they're not poor.
Yeah. Well, and the point being is that there's a lot of people who and in fact, actually, one of the groups that was in that list, motorists who want better travel options, right? I would have said this says motorists who want better travel options for other travelers. I would have said it should read motorists who want better travel options for themselves and other travelers. For example, one of the things I would say is that how much do you think it might cost you to travel, let's say, to Montreal? All right, Montreal is about 6 hour travel, 6 hours away, more or less, if you're going to drive there. So if you're going to drive there and you're going to, go for a family holiday or something, and you're taking your family of four there, it's probably going to cost you about $250 to $300, dependent upon your car. $250 to $350 for the return trip and travel around within Montreal if you're gonna be there for a few days, right? And if you want to, so if you're going to look at alternatives and you're going to say, okay, well, if I were to go to Montreal by train, how much is it going to cost you? And if the how much is it going to cost you answers $1,000, of course you're going to go by car.
Yeah. And this is the problem because driving is too cheap. And even when they're talking about the Policy Institute, when they're talking about from the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute, they talked about how driving is too cheap, and they were saying motorists do not pay near what it actually cost them to drive. And the way they talked about it, people would have to read these studies to understand, and how he analyzes it, how taxpayers do. There's another book out there. It's called The High Cost of Free Parking, okay, by David Shoup, okay, Shoup. You could probably find it in the library. It talks a lot about how much it costs to maintain free parking. It costs people who drive nothing, but it costs people, everybody, everything. If you go into a grocery store, part of what you pay in your prices goes to those who are parking there for free. Right? So, and there's a lot more to it too. There's maintenance and so forth for these parking lots and so forth. So it's very important to look at that. So they were making recommendations of what should happen. Having just a for cost type of parking, not like what they rate people at for the hospitals. But municipal parking lots where you get charged a certain amount, but not excessively.
Well, actually, one of the things is, that I was talking about in my election campaign when I, at the last election, is that I believe that it's wrong to actually charge people for medical premises, for parking at medical premises, because you're catching people when they are in their most desperate of situations, and you're saying, hey, you come here, you've got to pay to park. Well, and I think that's wrong.
Then that should also translate into that I should get free taxi service to the hospitals too, if I have to go for tests or whatever it is that I'm there for. So I mean, really, we all have to pay for it. Okay.
Yeah.
But
Well,
they shouldn't be raping you for it. I mean, if
no.
you're going there and they're charging you $50 a day or whatever, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. $50 a day is absolutely stupid.
Yeah,
I
they were
mean,
going after somebody in Toronto for that. She had to go for her child, and she had parking fees of like thousands of dollars for taking her child in for cancer treatments, and that is really unreasonable. But if you're going in and you're just paying for just a very basic fare, like $5 a day, I mean, that's it.
mm,
But to go for $50 a day or whatever it was that she was being paid for, that is very unfair and usurious.
yeah, and there's actually a balance to be had there, isn't there?
Yeah.
That's the question, right? Because the question is, do we, should we really be, um, you know, I think everybody's opposed to kind of, you know, that kind of ripping off people to pay to park. For example, though, hey, um, when it came to one particular car parking slot in on Eclipse Day that was charging $100 to park
Taking
versus
advantage of the situation.
the Niagara, Niagara Parks at $20 a day to park. Hey, that's I words fail me.
Exactly, where people are
No
just trying to be
advantage of
serious
people.
on the public. It's
Yeah,
just trying to take advantage of people in a situation who are driving around Niagara Falls, can't find a place to park, and then they see that, oh, $100 a day to park. That's very unfair. That's
yeah.
you can't be
I mean,
taking advantage.
what they did with that particular parking lot, by the way, is that's a sign which normally says it says $10 a day to park. It isn't
Mhm.
$10 a day. The a day is absolute rubbish. You can stay and park there all day, but it's $10 an hour, right?
Wow.
You can park there
Wow.
all day, but it's $10 an hour.
Mm.
So it's still going to cost you $100 a day if you park there all day. Park there for 10 hours, it's going to cost you $100.
I think the guy added another zero or something.
Yeah, yeah. That's all he did. Is he
Yeah.
added another zero for the eclipse day.
Yeah, that's how people were making money off the eclipse.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, just expect to get ripped off. And that's not right. People should be coming in,
Yeah.
expect people to come in, but don't rip them off. You're also not going to come to Niagara Falls again.
Well, and that's part of the problem that we have. Okay, so if we compare European to American to North American transport, there's clearly differences, aren't there?
Yes, definitely. Well, one works on where they have more public funding input into it. In Europe, they focus more on public funding where you have more people, where it's focused more on people and transferring people. Well, in the States, they do have public transit, but a lot of it is privately funded or pay or fare based, like where the
But
fares are
again,
supposed to. But nowhere,
again,
but nowhere the fares would meet the cost of operating a transit system, especially an
again,
effective transit system.
Angela, though, but again, hey, the London Underground was set up privately.
Yeah, but
It was a private company that set that up in the first place.
yeah, but it ended up more public funding as time went on.
Yeah, absolutely
Okay,
it did.
like it's probably not purely publicly funded. Like look at our buses that go around town, how they have advertisements on the buses and
Yeah.
different things within it. So there is a lot of private input into it, which is okay because sometimes that helps, you know. But to try to get it where everything is purely privately funded, you know, and that relies on fair revenue, you're not going to get it to a point where you're going to be able to operate it efficiently because you'll end up operating taxis, and people
Well,
will
I
have to
was
pay
gonna
like
say
taxis.
well, I was gonna say when it comes to the popular routes, you'll end up with 6 bus services going down the popular routes. But when it comes to the unpopular routes, it's like, I'm not touching that. And says the operator, hey,
Hmm.
that's not a profitable route. I'm not going down there.
That's
Right?
like Canada Post, okay? Like Canada Post is supposed to deliver mail to everywhere in Canada, whether you live rurally, right out the sticks, or whether you live in town or in a big city, right? Whether you live in a big apartment building or condo in Toronto. So Canada Post has to deliver everywhere. So Canada Post is profitable in the city, in the urban
Yeah.
areas. But as you get out in the country, it's not so profitable.
Yeah,
So
it's
people
not
who are
very profitable if you've got to drive 50 miles to deliver one
one
letter.
letter.
Yeah.
Yeah, to somebody who lives in the sticks.
Yeah.
So the thing is, so this is why you develop what they call equity, right? Vertical equity, and when they talk about that. So these are why people have that, and it allows people to live where they want. And the other important thing too about having public transit and having a good system of public transit is it improves housing costs for people who are of modest or middle or lower incomes. Because right now we're talking about where most of the transit is always in areas in Toronto, particularly where it's very high cost housing. And then if you want to get a cheaper house, you don't have transit nearby, so you end up having to have a car. And people in Toronto are going to get a big surprise when they move down here because they not only paying near to what they pay there for housing, but they're also going to have to buy a car on top of it. Okay, so
And learn
that's
to
not
drive. Yeah.
and learn how to drive for some of them. Hey, and
Yeah.
some of them are coming back and they're complaining about it. So
Yeah.
I think what has to happen is instead of trying to accommodate by getting everybody vehicles, we have to accommodate by being able to get people around. There will always be some who will stubbornly drive their car anywhere. But I think if we had a good, effective transit system, I think that the roads would be a lot more clearer for those that are going to be stubbornly done that.
I just thought I'd put that out there from Randy. The book was authored by Lee Lecoca.
But he
Um,
also ran Chrysler Corporation for quite a long time. So he had his hands into the auto industry. So
yeah.
see, I read all these things. Like I have a very good background in studying transportation, but that's when I taught the book before by a fellow who wrote the book on the NS&T railway. He was a railway buff kind of thing, and he had
That
pictures of the railway cars and different things in it. But when you're
I
talking
do.
about how it worked, that was fascinating. And
I
then when it was brought
find
up by
you.
the auto industry, that's when it becomes a problem.
I've seen plenty of historical things about trams in Niagara, and I'm like, whoa, we had trams in Niagara. And when you look at it, it's like I can see where there were tram networks in London and how the trams were actually removed in London, largely due to the bombing in the Second World War. Because what happened is the bombs which fell on many of the tram networks basically decimated the tram system during the course of the Second World War. Whilst it was easy to repair roads, it wasn't easy to repair tram tracks. So what tended to end up happening is we came out of the Second World War without trams in London because of the obliteration. And it was like, well, now we have to reignite the tram network. And people went, no, you know. The Greater London Council said, no, that's too much, too complicated, right? So they decided against that post-war because of the sheer devastation that happened.
Yeah, and then rebuilding it. And aren't they still paying for the war there in the UK?
Oh, yeah. They're still paying for the Napoleonic War. Come on. Anyway, we got to get
Yes,
going.
we do.
I got a hearing to go to. All right.
Yes, exactly. One that we learned about last
Friday.
week.
Friday. Yeah. Yep. There we go. Got this. Customer came in Friday for a Monday hearing, so I'm heading into the office right now. I think that's where we can have to call it a quits and head out.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Angela, for doing.
My pleasure.
We'll consider what our tomorrow's thing is going to be. And by the way, Wednesday we've got Laura Lococo here. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Yep. Take care. Take care,
Bye.
Niagara, and have a great day.
Bye.